The galactic cry for help. Across the galaxy, the stars shone brightly, as they always did. But something was different this time. The silence of space felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the very fabric of the universe was holding its breath. Across countless star systems, there were whispers of something terrible happening. The galaxy was in danger. It all began in the outer rim, where strange reports started flooding in. Entire colonies had vanished without a trace. Fleet commanders sent scouts, but none returned. Ships that entered the area were destroyed, their remains scattered across the void. Something was out there, something that no one could understand. The Galactic Council, made up of the most powerful races in the galaxy, convened in a high-security meeting. They had heard the rumors, the stories, but no one had enough evidence to make a clear decision. The invaders were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Powerful, intelligent, and relentless, they were sweeping across entire sectors, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. For the first time in centuries, panic gripped the leaders of the galaxy. The enemy had not shown themselves fully, but the signs were enough. They were coming, and no one knew how to stop them. The once confident council leaders, who had negotiated peace between rival factions for decades, now found themselves powerless. The message was clear. The galaxy was in danger, and if nothing was done, entire civilizations would be wiped out. But what could they do? They were running out of time. Then, in the midst of this chaos, a decision was made. A bold, dangerous decision. A decision that would bring hope or disaster. The message was sent. A signal, simple and urgent. SOS. It was a call for help, not just to any nearby fleets or systems, but to the only group that might have a chance at turning the tide. The Deathworlders. For centuries, the Deathworlders had been a mystery to the rest of the galaxy. They were a species shrouded in fear and legend. They lived on a planet so hostile that it was nearly impossible for any other species to survive there. The planet was a living nightmare, where only the strongest could thrive. The Deathworlders themselves were creatures of immense power, intelligence, and brutality, honed by the dangers of their homeworld. They had long since distanced themselves from the galaxy's politics. They were feared, respected, and ultimately avoided. Their ships had not been seen in generations, their fleets silent and hidden away. The Deathworlders had no need for the galaxy. But now, a desperate SOS had reached them. The message echoed across the vast expanse of space, a plea for help from those who could no longer protect themselves. The signal traveled through the stars, bouncing off ancient relays and fading into the unknown. The Galactic Council waited in silence, hoping for a response, fearing the worst. Then, after what felt like an eternity, something happened. A faint, strange pulse came back from the void. It wasn't like any signal they had ever received. It was powerful, direct, and full of purpose. The Deathworlders had received the call. But would they respond? The Council watched anxiously as the seconds ticked by. No one knew what the Deathworlders would do. Would they help, or would they ignore the galaxy's plea? The fate of billions rested on this one decision. It was then that the true nature of the Deathworlders began to reveal itself. The galaxy had sent out a simple request for help, but the Deathworlders' response would be anything but simple. It would be something that no one was prepared for. The time for waiting was over. The galaxy's last hope had awoken, and no one knew what would happen next. The unlikely response. The message had been sent. The galaxy's most powerful leaders waited in tense silence as they stared at the massive communications display, wondering what would happen next. Every moment felt like an eternity, and the uncertainty gripped their hearts. They had sent a plea for help, but now they weren't sure if their message would even be acknowledged. In the heart of the galaxy, the leaders sat in their grand council chambers. Their minds were focused on the possibility of the Deathworlders responding, but they also knew the risk. If the Deathworlders chose not to act, or worse, if they decided to act on their own terms, the galaxy would be forever changed. The silence in the room was unbearable as everyone waited for any sign of movement from the Deathworlders. The Galactic Council was accustomed to diplomacy, to discussions, and to calculated responses. They had faced many crises before, but this was different. The enemy they faced wasn't just a rival faction. It was something far worse, an unknown force that had the potential to destroy everything in its path. The Deathworlders were no ordinary species. Their world had bred them into fierce, almost unstoppable warriors. They had survived on a planet where every moment was a struggle for survival. Their environment was more hostile than any battlefield, and the creatures that roamed their lands were the stuff of nightmares. But the Deathworlders had survived and thrived. What would they do now, when faced with a galaxy in peril? The moments stretched on. Finally, as hope began to fade, a response came. The signal was faint at first, almost as if it had been transmitted from the edge of known space. But then, with shocking clarity, a message echoed across the Galactic Council's comms. A single word. Confirmed. It was brief, but it carried weight. The Deathworlders had received the SOS, and they were coming. For the leaders of the Galactic Council, that word was both a relief and a terror. The Deathworlders were answering the call, but no one knew what that would mean. Their reputation was legendary, and their methods were unknown. The galaxy had never truly understood them, and now they were about to face the full force of the Deathworlders' response. The signal had been sent, and it had been received. The next step was terrifyingly simple. The Deathworlders were coming, and when they arrived, everything would change. Across the galaxy, the message spread like wildfire. News of the Deathworlders' response sent shockwaves through every system. It was no longer a question of if they would arrive, but when. And more importantly, how would they arrive? In the vast darkness of space, the Deathworlders' fleet began to stir. The galaxy's last hope was not a peaceful negotiation or a strategic alliance. It was a force of nature, an unstoppable, relentless power that had no equal. As the Deathworlders prepared their ships, the galaxy's leaders had to make a choice. Would they stand alongside these terrifying beings, or would they fear what they could do? They didn't have long to decide. The first ships began to emerge from the edges of the galaxy, their sleek forms cutting through space with terrifying speed. The sound of their arrival was like a storm on the horizon, a rumble of thunder that sent shivers down the spines of anyone who dared to listen. The Deathworlders' fleet had begun its journey to answer the call. But in the back of every leader's mind was the question: were they prepared for what was about to happen? The galaxy had no idea what awaited them. No one knew if the Deathworlders would be their salvation or their doom. And as the fleet advanced toward the heart of the galaxy, one thing became clear. The countdown had begun. The gathering storm. The fleet of Deathworlders moved faster than anything the galaxy had ever seen. It wasn't just the size of the fleet that was intimidating. It was the way they moved. Each ship seemed to glide through space with a terrifying grace, their dark silhouettes cutting through the stars like shadows on a stormy night. In the command rooms of the Galactic Council, the leaders watched in stunned silence as the first images of the fleet arrived. Thousands of ships, all moving with the same purpose, the same drive. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. They had been gathering at the galaxy's edges, waiting. The arrival wasn't sudden, it was inevitable. Across countless systems, planets held their breath, knowing that the decision to call upon the Deathworlders had been made. Some rejoiced, hopeful that the ruthless power of the Deathworlders would rid them of their enemies. Others trembled in fear, unsure of what the Deathworlders would demand in return. Would they be allies or conquerors? The Galactic Council had hoped that the Deathworlders' reputation for unpredictable actions would be enough to deter them. But now, as the fleet drew closer, it was clear that there was no going back. The Deathworlders had made their decision. They were coming, and they would not be ignored. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, planets were already preparing for the worst. Military leaders scrambled to gather forces, readying their defenses in the event that the Deathworlders arrived with intentions other than peaceful intervention. But even their best preparations seemed weak in comparison to what was coming. The Deathworlders weren't like any army they had faced before. The fleet grew larger and larger as more ships appeared from the edges of space. It was like watching a dark storm front approaching, with no way to predict how devastating it would be. Would they bring salvation, or would they destroy everything in their path? On one of the planets that lay in the Deathworlders' path, a group of civilians gathered to watch the sky. They had heard the stories, tales of the terrifying warriors from the Deathworlds who could crush entire civilizations with a single strike. They knew that the fate of their world was uncertain, and as the ships drew nearer, fear and excitement mixed in their hearts. No one knew how the Deathworlders would act. They were more than just conquerors. They were a force of nature, survivors of a brutal world that had taught them the value of strength and survival. If they came to save the galaxy, they would do so on their own terms. If they came to conquer, there was little anyone could do to stop them. The closer the fleet got, the more the galaxy's leaders realized how unprepared they were. They had called for help, yes, but what kind of help would it be? As the first ships entered the outer reaches of the galaxy, every leader, every citizen, braced themselves for the unknown. At the Galactic Council's headquarters, the tension was unbearable. Every monitor, every screen, was filled with images of the Deathworlders' fleet. The ships were unlike anything seen before, massive, sleek, and dark, almost as if they were born from the void itself. Then, just as the first wave of ships passed through the galaxy's outer rim, a strange signal was detected. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a command. It was something else, something deeply unsettling. The signal was a warning. The Deathworlders were here, and they were making their presence known. But what was the warning? The galactic leaders stared at their monitors, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. It wasn't a threat, but it was clear. The Deathworlders had their own reasons for being here, and the galaxy had better be prepared for whatever came next. The storm was closing in, and no one knew how to face it. Would the Deathworlders be the galaxy's saviors, or would they bring about its final destruction? The answers were out of their hands now. The battle for survival had already begun, and the only thing left to do was watch as the Deathworlders made their move. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the signal stopped. Silence. The fleet continued its approach. The countdown had begun, and soon the galaxy would know the true power of the Deathworlders. The unexpected response. As the Deathworlders' fleet drew nearer to the heart of the galaxy, fear gripped every corner of space. The galaxy's leaders, who once believed they could control any situation with diplomacy and force, now realized they had no power against what was coming. The Deathworlders were unlike any species they had ever encountered, ruthless, unyielding, and driven by an unknown purpose. The fleet continued to advance, every ship moving in perfect coordination, like a massive, unstoppable force. Their presence was undeniable, their intentions unclear. Some believed they had come to destroy, others to dominate, but no one could say for certain. On one of the outermost planets, a group of civilian observers stood on a rooftop, watching the fleet's approach. Their eyes widened as the dark ships glided across the sky, their sleek, ominous shapes filling the horizon. The air was thick with anticipation, and the weight of the moment seemed to press down on everyone who was watching. Far from the surface, in the command center of the Galactic Council, leaders from across the galaxy stood in silence. They were waiting for the fleet to make its next move. And then, it happened. The ships of the Deathworlders came to a halt, hovering just outside the galaxy's central systems. A chilling silence settled in space. The leaders of the galaxy could only guess what was happening. Were the Deathworlders preparing for an attack? Were they gathering their strength? Or was something else unfolding? For hours, the galaxy watched, unable to make a move of their own. No one dared to approach the fleet. And then the answer came. Without warning, one of the largest ships in the fleet released a message, broadcast across the galaxy in every language known. The message was simple, but its meaning would send shockwaves across the galaxy. "We are here." The words echoed through the galaxy, sent to every corner of space, to every planet and station that had eyes on the fleet. The Deathworlders were not here to conquer. They were not here to destroy. They were here to make a statement. But what did it mean? On every planet, every station, and every ship that received the message, one question rose to the surface. What had the galaxy done to warrant the arrival of the Deathworlders? The message did not explain why they had come or what they wanted. But the power behind the words left no room for doubt. The Deathworlders had come with a purpose, and the galaxy was now at their mercy. Meanwhile, in the darkest corners of the galaxy, some began to whisper the stories they had heard. Rumors of the Deathworlders' true power, of their strength, of their brutal past. These rumors painted a terrifying picture. The Deathworlders were not like the peaceful, diplomatic races that ruled over the galaxy. They were survivors of a world where only the strongest lived. And now, they were here, among them, with a fleet that seemed ready to wipe out anything in their way. Back at the Galactic Council, the leaders convened once more. They could not ignore the warning any longer. The Deathworlders were not an enemy that could be reasoned with. They were an unstoppable force. But the question remained, why had they come? What did they want? The silence in the command room grew thick with uncertainty. They knew they had to act, but the weight of their decision hung heavy. Should they attack? Should they offer peace? Or should they prepare for the unknown? In the midst of all this uncertainty, one thing was clear. The galaxy had never faced anything like the Deathworlders. And now, it was too late to turn back. The next move was in the hands of the Deathworlders, and the galaxy could only wait and hope that they had made the right choice in calling for their help. As the fleet lingered in space, the galaxy held its breath, waiting for the next step in this new and terrifying chapter of their history. Would the Deathworlders unleash their fury upon the galaxy, or was something else, something more terrifying, waiting just beyond the horizon? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The galaxy would never be the same again. The battle begins. The galaxy was on edge. As the Deathworlders' fleet loomed in the darkness, a profound sense of unease spread across every world. Every military leader, every fleet commander, and every ruler knew that a decision had to be made. But no one dared to make the first move. The galaxy had no idea what they were up against. The fleet was unlike anything seen before. Its ships were sleek, terrifying, and powerful, and their arrival had been marked by a single chilling message. "We are here." It was clear that the Deathworlders had come with a purpose. What that purpose was, however, remained a mystery. Were they preparing for war? Were they allies, or were they enemies? The galaxy had no answers. The stakes were higher than ever, and no one knew how to play their cards. Across the galaxy, fleets were mobilizing. Commanders issued orders, scrambling to prepare for a possible conflict. Some of them feared the worst, an invasion, an unstoppable force coming to wipe out everything in its path. Others remained hopeful, clinging to the idea that the Deathworlders had come to offer their help, just as the SOS message had implied. But even those with hope in their hearts were unsure how to respond. In the command center of the Galactic Council, the leaders convened again, their faces grim and full of uncertainty. The room was filled with tension, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They had no choice but to make a decision, but there were no good options. To wait was to risk the destruction of everything they had built. To act recklessly could provoke a war with a species far beyond their understanding. The debate raged on, but no solution emerged. As the hours passed, the tension became unbearable. And then, without warning, the first shot was fired. It wasn't from the Deathworlders' fleet, but from a smaller, more desperate ship. One of the galaxy's military commanders, unable to wait any longer, made the decision to launch an offensive strike. His ship fired at the closest Deathworlder vessel. A single shot, but it was enough to spark a response. The sky erupted in a blaze of light and energy. The Deathworlders were not caught off guard. Their fleet, having anticipated such an act of aggression, reacted swiftly and decisively. A hail of fire returned from their ships, targeting the attacking fleet with precision and force. The first battle had begun. The galaxy watched in horror and awe as the clash unfolded. It wasn't just a battle of ships, it was a display of unmatched power. The Deathworlders' fleet was like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Their ships moved with unimaginable speed and precision, each blow sending shockwaves through the battlefield. No one had ever seen such ferocity, such raw power in combat. The military fleets that had gathered to defend the galaxy were no match for the Deathworlders. Every shot they fired was either dodged or destroyed before it even got close. The Deathworlders, it seemed, were on a level of warfare the galaxy had never dreamed of. Their response was calculated, precise, and terrifying. On the surface of planets far below, civilians watched in fear and awe as explosions lit up the sky. The ground shook with the force of the battle taking place above. Cities evacuated, and the people who had once thought themselves safe in their distant corners of the galaxy now realized that no place was safe. The Deathworlders had shown no mercy, and they had made it clear they were not here to negotiate. As the battle raged on, the leaders of the galaxy had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. They were outmatched. But that didn't mean they would surrender. There was still hope that the Deathworlders might be willing to negotiate. But with each passing moment, the chance of peace seemed to grow slimmer. The Deathworlders had made it clear that they would not back down. For the galaxy, the battle was only beginning. The unknown power of the Deathworlders had been unleashed, and now every corner of the galaxy faced an uncertain future. The question that everyone was asking: what did the Deathworlders want? Was this a fight for survival, or something far more terrifying? As the battle continued, the answers would come, and the galaxy would have to face the consequences of their choices. But for now, one thing was clear: the Deathworlders had made their mark on the galaxy, and no one would ever forget the day their fleet arrived, igniting a conflict that would shape the future for generations to come. The aftermath. The battle was over, but the devastation left in its wake was undeniable. The once vibrant galaxy, filled with bustling spaceports and thriving civilizations, now lay in ruins. The Deathworlders' fleet had proven their might beyond any doubt, and no one had been prepared for the sheer scale of their power. The first wave of destruction had been swift. Ships were obliterated in seconds, entire fleets reduced to nothing more than burning debris. The Deathworlders did not hesitate. They acted with precision, as though they had planned every move down to the last detail. Every counterattack from the galaxy's forces had been crushed with ease. And yet, despite the overwhelming power on display, there had been no further escalation. After the initial strikes, the Deathworlders seemed to pause. Their fleet hovered ominously in the void, watching, waiting. They didn't continue their advance. They didn't finish the job. For all their terrifying power, they held back. The galaxy was left in limbo. There were no formal declarations of war, no terms of surrender. The Deathworlders simply waited. This strange, ominous silence sent shivers down the spine of every leader in the galaxy. Across countless systems, governments scrambled to pick up the pieces of their shattered defenses. The damage was immense, but it was not just physical. There were deep cracks forming in the alliances that had once held the galaxy together. Some factions, desperate to protect their own interests, began to consider negotiating with the Deathworlders. Others, fearful of any form of compromise, called for a full-scale mobilization to try and push the invaders back. But all knew that the Deathworlders' response had been only a warning. If they wanted to, the fleet could annihilate every fleet, every military base, and every city in the galaxy. That power was theirs to wield. Yet, as the days passed, no further attacks came. The Deathworlders' ships lingered, their presence a constant reminder of the galaxy's vulnerability. No one knew what the Deathworlders were waiting for. Some believed they were waiting for the galaxy to bend, to submit to their will. Others thought they were waiting for a sign, some sort of answer to the challenge they had presented. And then the message came. It wasn't a grand announcement. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was simple, chilling, and to the point. Defend your world, or face our wrath. The galaxy had been put on notice. The Deathworlders had given them a chance, one final chance to prove their worth, to show they could defend themselves, to resist, or face total annihilation. On the Galactic Council, leaders convened again, now with a renewed sense of urgency. They had seen the power of the Deathworlders. They had felt the weight of their presence, and they knew that if they failed to respond in time, there would be no second chances. The question was no longer whether they could defeat the Deathworlders. It was whether they could even survive the coming trials. But despite the overwhelming odds, there was a glimmer of hope. The galaxy was filled with resourceful, determined people, and even in the face of such a formidable foe, they were unwilling to give up without a fight. The galaxy's defenders began to regroup, to strategize, and to prepare for the coming storm. Every world, every species, began to look inward, seeking any advantage, any way to stand against the Deathworlders. But as they did, they realized the cruel truth. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their very identity, for the future of everything they had built. The Deathworlders had made their intentions clear. Now, it was up to the galaxy to decide whether to accept their fate or to challenge the unknown forces that had arrived at their doorstep. The final decision. The days that followed the message from the Deathworlders were filled with uncertainty and fear. Every leader, military strategist, and civilian on the edge of the conflict waited with bated breath. The choice had been given to them: defend or perish. But what did it truly mean to defend against the unstoppable might of the Deathworlders? Across the galaxy, resistance groups rallied, gathering resources and assembling forces. But even the bravest commanders knew that facing the Deathworlders would not be easy. For years, the galaxy had prided itself on its unity, its technological superiority, and its power to maintain peace. But that illusion was shattered with the first devastating wave from the Deathworlders. Yet, amid the fear, something unexpected began to happen. Different factions, once rivals, began to set aside old grudges. The Terran League, long seen as a solitary force, reached out to the Arkan Confederation and the Vecna clan. They all knew that only through unity could they stand any chance at survival. In secret meeting rooms, the galaxy's greatest minds came together, pooling their knowledge in a desperate attempt to build a strategy. Scientists worked tirelessly to understand the Deathworlders' technology. Engineers labored to improve their fleets, adding whatever advanced weaponry could be found or reverse-engineered. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the preparations continued, word began to spread. A force was being built, a coalition, not of just one species, but of many. The Deathworlders would see their united front. The leaders hoped that this act of unity would send a message. Maybe, just maybe, the Deathworlders would realize that the galaxy was not as fractured as they had believed. Maybe they could be reasoned with. But even the most optimistic of strategists knew that the odds were stacked against them. The Deathworlders had never failed to show their superiority. Even if the coalition was able to launch a defense, could it withstand the full might of an enemy who had already shown their ability to destroy without mercy? And then, as if to answer the question, the first sign of the Deathworlders' next move appeared. The massive fleet that had been hovering above the galaxy's systems began to mobilize. The ships, sleek and dark, moved in perfect formation, their weapons ready. It was clear. The Deathworlders were making their move. The time for waiting was over. As the fleet advanced, the galaxy's defenders made their final preparations. Ships took their positions, and weapons systems hummed to life. They knew that this would be their one chance to prove themselves. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for their very future. And even if the odds were against them, they were determined to make it count. The countdown to the greatest battle the galaxy had ever seen had begun. But something unexpected happened as the two fleets came into view. The Deathworlders, who had once been ruthless and unyielding, slowed. For a moment, there was a tense silence in the vastness of space. Ships from both sides hovered, engines quiet, weapons still. The galaxy's defenders held their breath. Were the Deathworlders truly about to strike? Then, across the comm channels, a message was broadcast. A simple, yet chilling message. Your move. It was clear. The Deathworlders were no longer the aggressors. Now, they were waiting. They had shown their power. They had tested the resolve of the galaxy. And now, the next step was up to the defenders. Would they act with the same determination, the same courage that the Deathworlders had shown? The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. Would the galaxy's defenders rise to the challenge, or would they falter in the face of such a mighty foe? The battle was not yet won, and the Deathworlders' fleet was still ready to strike. But in this moment, the galaxy had been given one last chance to prove that they could defend themselves. One final chance to answer the call. And as the two fleets stood in the void of space, it became clear the war for the galaxy's future had truly begun.